Hello and welcome to Fire Headlines, where we discuss the hottest topics in fire service news. I'm your host, Samantha Didion. Joining me on the panel this week is Chief Bob Horton to discuss an article shared in the Daily Dispatch. This article is about a woman who uploaded a video on TikTok to help educate people on what not to do when dealing with a grease fire. And this article really brings forth the idea of how more and more people are gathering their vital information from social media. So we're going to discuss the ways you can communicate with your community through social media and other outlets. To start off today's conversation, I want to ask, how do you believe modern-day fire agencies should be communicating with their communities?
Well, thank you, Samantha, and it's always great to be back to visit with you. And I think this is such an important conversation. In fact, one that you and I have had when when you joined the team as a community engagement coordinator. We were trying to solve for this. Right? We're trying to figure out how do we connect with our community. Before I answer that, though, I tell you what, I got hooked on just watching that video on loop. So it's not surprising to me that 6 million people, I think, or so at the time that I looked at it, had seen this woman's experience of lighting her kitchen on fire. Where are people going for information? And that has changed from, when some of us started in this profession to where we're at today. It's changed significantly. Because back in the day, you'd be on the news or in the newspaper. I was communicating with somebody all not that long ago just about this topic, about how do you get someone to read information that you want them to have, like from a fire safety perspective. And he says, he was sort of asserting, no, you've got to send it into my mailbox. He's a millennial, younger end of the millennial spectrum, and talked about, so I'm not going to see it in the news. So I might see it, in social media, but you don't know. But if you want me to get a message, you want to be confident in it, it needs to go into the mailbox. Now, I already shared the demographic of this particular person who was sharing that with me, but I think had I not, you might have conjured up somebody in an elder baby boomer type generation. That would have been my assumption. Is there members of the population who just prefer to get things in the mail, who aren't on social media? But this is somebody who turns to social media for predominantly a lot of their information. And his point wasn't that social media isn't the right platform for it. His point was it may get lost. It may get lost in algorithms. So I know that wasn't your particular question, and maybe you can offer some insight to the conversation as it pertains to algorithms, because I know that I don't know how much of that works. Here's your question about what fire chiefs need to be thinking about. If you want to be the messenger to your community, and you should, you have to establish trust in your community. Your organization has to be trusted as a trusted institution of information, and your messenger has to be trusted. So it's harder and harder in some of the, depending on what political ideology that you and your community work in, but like across the board, there's a growing distrust for government institutions. Now, my experience is that's not so much the fire service. Fire service still remains in many of our communities the trusted voice, but that only adds more responsibility to the message. So how do communities receive information? Well, they're across the board. Some are reading it in the newspaper, some are watching it in the news, some are getting it in the mailbox like we had talked about, and many are turning to various social media channels. So a strategy I implore all fire chiefs, and sorry, this is going to take resources to make it happen, is you need to be touching all of those mediums if you want to connect with your community.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, Bob. And a couple episodes ago, we had ODF's Public Information Officer, Natalie Weber, on Fire Headlines. And something that she said that I think is true across the board, whether you're a shop or an agency or whatever you are, if you're not telling your story, somebody else is telling it for you. If you're not sharing what happened yourself on the fire incident, the spectators that saw it happen, they're going to turn to social media and say what they saw happen. And maybe that's not accurate. Maybe they only saw one side of it, or they're not fire service experts. They don't know exactly what's happening or what the procedures are, such as, like, for instance, I believe when I was still in the news,
Mhm.
they were letting a fire continue on rather than starting it because letting that debris burn was going to be more beneficial in the long run. Does that sound familiar?
Yep. Rather than putting it out. Yep.
Yeah, and so sometimes when a community sees that, they're saying, why aren't the firefighters doing anything? Why are they letting it burn? The smoke build up, the air quality build up. They don't know all the different factors that might have gone into that decision. Now, if the agency were to turn around and post on social media, this is why that's happening, then that clears it up, and that leads to a better relationship between that fire department and then that community.
Communicating with clarity is in part what helps develop that element of trust. And the message isn't always going to be popular. You don't get to always just give the popular message, but the one that provides clarity allows for the conversation to be about, maybe the trade-offs of that decision. And this is like listen, there's no perfect message where a fire official is going to, like the story you were just illustrating, where you're going to get in front of the community and say, hey, we let it burn, because the trade-off of letting it burn may in fact be an air quality issue that is going to concern some vulnerable populations. Those are things that you certainly consider, and people aren't going to agree with the decision, and they're going to be angry, and they're going to post about it.
Yeah, and another point I was going to make when it comes to people going to social media for their news is more and more, if you watch broadcast television news, I bet within one show, 1 hour newscast, at some point they will say, so and so posted on X, which formerly known as Twitter, or this agency posted on Facebook that, X, Y, and Z. When an agency posts on social media, news outlets are using that as their on-air content. So not only is a fire agency informing their communities through social media, but they're allowing the news outlets to then elevate their voice to maybe people who aren't on social media. My grandmother's 97 years old and she doesn't even know how to switch from cable TV to Netflix. But so she watches news like that's all she watches is all the time. And she can't see that well, so she doesn't read the newspaper either. So she gets most of her information through broadcast news. And they're sharing the news that they find on social media. So that is another avenue to maybe reach your other demographics that are not on social media.
Well, I think you make an excellent point, and you persuaded me when we worked together before, because we were using an old, dare I say, antiquated methodology of media releases that I'm fairly certain ended up on a fax machine. Yeah, we shifted our communication strategy to using the platforms, social media platforms, to deliver, a quote media release. And that is what sparked interests in our story. So you're capturing different target audiences through that one channel potentially. And so that's an important part of a modern day communication strategy for your organization to be in front of these issues, is getting yourself on, into the various, you mentioned several of them. I'm not sure who's on Facebook much anymore. I mean, I'm limited. My social media is limited to that. So it isn't that I'm a social media genius. I'm by no means a social media person. Like, I'm part of, now I'm this generation that's dying off, that's like only, kind of Facebook to maybe see events that are populating. But I don't dismiss the value and the importance of it, because this is how we're communicating across multiple generations and in different different platforms. So I agree, and you were the one who who really taught me that, is like, let's get this out into a social media feed. It's going to get picked up by local news, and what was exciting about that, at least in our media market, was it didn't necessarily prompt, if media release was full of the information, and having a journalist like yourself on staff that can produce content like that there's the demand for, the story wrote itself and made it in the evening news, and probably, or in the website, because maybe rather than a newspaper, You might read print news on your produced news, desk type of thing. So, yes, agree completely that making sure you get information out, and we should probably talk about timeliness of information and getting information out, at least on an incident, that's timely. That's a new piece that we're wrestling with as fire agencies and fire chiefs are trying to have to solve.
Yeah, what I was going to ask you was, we've talked about some of the stuff that we do believe should be on social media and how it's important for fire agencies to utilize social media. But what do you believe should not be on social media?
Oh boy. Well, I tell you what, certainly employees, should be keenly aware. And that's, I mean, the fire chief all the way down of how information or how posts or comments or videos can be perceived out of context. So I think being incredibly intentional about what the message and how the message is being received is important. Uh, there are some elements of social media done maybe by a private, like an employee, privately about their organization, that is not protected, or some might be protected by First Amendment free speech, and some may not be. And I'm not qualified to opine on what is or isn't considered the First Amendment right in terms of protections, uh, but being really intentional now as an individual on what it is that you post. If you're working on duty and you're posting to social media and shooting video from an incident, that's not responsible, right? And you're also providing voice on behalf of your organization when that may not necessarily be the right message and or time for it. So let me zoom out of the kind of individual employee, but looking at it as an organization. When, as a government entity, when you put that message out on social media, you own that message for life. That becomes a matter of the public record. So you don't, you know, get to just delete it off because you don't like it, or you get comments in. You can shut off comments, though. I think that is a thing. But when it's out there, when you introduce it to the universe, it is a matter of public record at this point. You're not supposed to destroy it. You're not supposed to remove that. So being real intentional, again, I'll use that word, about what messages get out. Now, I see messaging in a couple of different ways, and weigh in if I'm missing some of them. But there's certainly getting timely information about a fire incident or an emergency incident out, and to me that's a different communications strategy and tactic than you would use if you're doing a feature piece or something in terms of a general public safety message, say ahead of the 4th of July or something like this, or a feel good piece about your organization and your interface with the community. I think there's a much higher risk associated with how we communicate during a fire incident. And I think there's a tension right now amongst various disciplines and what they think that message is, like what is to post and what's not to post. And I have this conversation with a lot of fire chiefs, and I hope our listeners are thinking a lot about this. And this is about communicating to your community when you're facing uncertainty. So as a disaster is unfolding and you don't know where the next level of evacuations may need to be, but you're being pressed to answer that question by responsible outlets trying to get information to the community, there's this threshold of confidence in the information you have that I'm arguing we need to challenge our comfort level in what that threshold looks like. So let me give you an example. On one extreme is we have 100% perfect information. We know in a wildfire, for example, we know where the fire is going. We know which homes are going to be threatened. We know what routes those people need to take. And we've issued alerts and warnings, and they're evacuating, and they're getting them out, and then we know where to go and all of this kind of thing. That would be a perfect information scenario. We don't have perfect information. We have uncertainty, and we measure in some of these degrees of probabilities, to suggest that, well, we think the fire with 80%, 70%, 90% confidence is going to move in this direction, but the wind may shift since we've made that prediction. And when the wind shifts, then the information we have is different and the message has to change. So here we wrestle with the tension, Samantha, as I see it. And I'm curious your thoughts on this is, do we release the information, the best information we have when we have it, to get it in front of the community, and then shift that information when we learn something new that fills in some of the blanks? Or do we wait? Do we wait till we have stronger confidence? And our tendency in government is to wait till we have stronger confidence. And the problem, as I see with that, is the what you had just said earlier on, which is you're not filling in the story. And when you leave gaps in the story, someone else, one, people are going to fill it in their own brain, right? They're going to think, they're going to use, they're going to decide what they think the facts really are. And in worst cases, you've got other narrators telling the story on social media. This is what's going on. And people are going, there's a demand for information. And if we as government aren't providing it, someone else is filling that demand with less good, worser, something like that, right? with worse information. And I feel like then we're playing defense. We're coming from behind from that point forward in trying to now build ourselves as a trusted messenger in the community. So, there's a lot in terms of liability that enters into our thoughts and our conversation. And this is a conversation about, what do we say versus what we don't, or acts of commission versus omission. I'm just saying, as a fire chief, my philosophy is I want the best information that I have with that's within reason, to get that in front of the community as early as reasonably possible. And I realize I make that sound like it's easy to do. It absolutely isn't. Now, what are your thoughts on this tension between informing the public with uncertain information versus waiting till you have some level of, higher degrees of certainty before you communicate? After all, you've had to interface with angry media and angry constituents about trying to learn more. And it's not helpful for you if the fire chief says, don't say anything.
It's a very good question because I have seen both sides of it. It was a fire several years back in Oregon, and there were two major fires right very, very close to each other. And the reporter had heard from a firefighter that he believed the fires had merged. And so that reporter, wanting to be the first one to break that news, posted on what was then Twitter that the two fires had merged, and it was getting a lot of traction. And so the other reporters were calling up the public information officers on that incident saying, I'm hearing this from another news channel. Is this true? And the public information officer saying no. So this is an example of how getting that information out quickly, although this is a reporter, not a fire official making this, was damaging to then that channel's credibility. So I can see both sides of it. Do we wait and make sure the information's certain, or do we post it as soon as we can? If you are and that's kind of hard, I would have to say it's case by case. It depends on what exactly the scenario is. How pressing is that information? How vital is it? Are we talking about a possible, level 3 evacuation, or are we talking about, like, I don't know, something not as significant? But I will say that if you're posting it on social media, what I think is the most beneficial thing for your audience is to always include always update your original post. Clarify that this is an update and clarify exactly what time you are making that update at. Because if someone sees an update, but they don't see a time, and it's like a level 2 evacuation, but it actually was hours ago and now it's level 3, or it's actually gone down to level 1, there's just too much room for confusion. To eliminate that
Right.
whole confusing mess, always have the time with your update.
I agree with your assessment there, Samantha, that it's certainly going to be case by case and it's going to be context dependent. But what I do think chiefs need to be thinking about, and having this conversation amongst your staff before you're in an emergency, is about how, what confidence level do you need to have to get information out? What's your philosophy on information sharing? Now, I think back to trusted organization, trusted narrator. Is the first time your community going to see you when something bad happens on the news? You're unlikely to have a trusted voice inside that community. Now, you do get to carry a little bit of a fire service trust, most likely in your community, but you should be uh, uh, seen as a trusted voice. You should be intentional. You should be working through your communication strategy and the communications plan in your organization, that people know who you are, and they know they have they keep going back to this element of trust and what it is that you say, so that when bad things happen, and I don't mean just emergencies, but maybe there's God forbid, a traffic collision involving a fire engine, where it hits a vehicle, and you're going to end up being on the news that night to talk about it. Is your likelihood of an outcome is better if you're trusted, if your institution is trusted, and you're forthcoming and provide clarity and take responsibility when you have responsibility to take.
So closing thoughts, Bob, what do you believe are the three key takeaways or any key takeaways for fire service leaders when it comes to communicating with their communities?
First, communication cannot be left to chance. It has to be intentional. It has to be part of your strategy and tactics. Two, you have to be a trusted communicator, both as an individual, and that means you, the fire chief, and your designated spokesperson, and your institution. And if you don't have that trust in your community, then it's time to start building it. And there are methods and ways that you could go to rebuild trust if you've had a bad experience, for example. But being aggressive in your strategy to build and develop and maintain trust, because if people trust you when things are good, then they're more likely going to trust you when things are bad. And that's important. And to use every method. So third is every method of communications that your demographics are using. And I assure you it's well across the board. So no getting to be grumpy about social media and dismissing it and saying, I don't, we don't do that. I don't do that, that kind of thing. You don't have to do it, but your organization does. So no grumpy about social media. You need to be on all of them. You need to be on X. You need to be on Instagram. You need to be on TikTok, dare I say it. And just because I know there's so much controversy over data and government data and these kinds of things, figure that out. Bring in IT experts, figure out what's going on. I don't really understand it, but here's what I know. I know your community is on TikTok. I know people within your community are turning to that for information. So it needs to be part of your strategy. Facebook for people like me, make sure you're still getting those messages out across there. Maybe once a month, I'll check it and something important will go on. And don't forget the mailbox. It's the most expensive way to meet your community, but people will read it. You can't just assume that by pushing a message out in one medium that you've got your audience. So be intentional, reach out across those spectrums. So those are my three things, Samantha.
And I'll add to that, on social media, don't just post on there, engage with your community members who are commenting and replying to your posts. Don't just post it on there and then say, well, it's good, it's done. Follow through, read your comments, read your inbox, and engage with them there, because they'll really appreciate that too. Thank you, Chief, for joining us today, and thank you to our listeners for tuning in. A link to the article we discussed can be found in the show notes. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe and follow us on social media. If you have a question for the panel, please reach out to us at fireheadlines@wfca.com and let us know what's on your mind. We'll see you back here next week for more Fire Headlines.